Millionaire hires a butler, then discovers he's his estranged father. William Armitage leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming against the polished mahogany desk in his study. The sprawling estate outside the windows was quiet, blanketed in the soft golden hues of the setting sun. Inside, however, William's mind was anything but calm. His assistant, Margaret, stood nearby, clutching a clipboard. "I don't care about excuses," William said curtly, his voice sharp. "I need someone competent this time. Not someone who spills my wine or forgets my schedule." Margaret nodded, not daring to meet his gaze. "I understand, sir. The final candidate is waiting outside. Should I bring him in?" "Do it," William said, waving a dismissive hand. "And let's hope this one has at least half a brain." Moments later, the door opened, and a man in his late 60s stepped inside. He was tall and carried himself with a calm, measured dignity. His suit, though simple, was impeccably tailored, and his silver hair was neatly combed back. He walked with a faint limp, but his expression was composed, almost serene. "Good evening, Mr. Armitage," the man said with a slight bow. "My name is Henry." William's sharp eyes swept over him, taking in every detail. There was something about the man, an air of quiet confidence, that irritated him. He was used to people looking nervous or intimidated in his presence. This man seemed unaffected. "You've read the job description?" William asked, his tone clipped. "I have, sir," Henry replied evenly. "I understand the responsibilities and believe I'm well suited for the role." "Well, that's what the last three said," William muttered. "And yet here we are. What makes you different?" Henry's lips curved into a faint smile. "Experience, sir. I've spent decades in similar positions, managing households and ensuring everything runs smoothly. I take pride in my work." William leaned forward slightly, narrowing his eyes. "And why, at your age, are you still working as a butler? Shouldn't you be retired by now?" Henry's smile didn't falter, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something that William couldn't quite place. "Let's just say I'm not the type to sit idly, sir." The two men stared at each other for a moment, the room filled with a tense silence. Then, William leaned back in his chair and gestured toward Margaret. "Fine. You're hired. Margaret will handle the details." "Thank you, sir," Henry said with another small bow. He turned to leave, but before he reached the door, William called after him. "Don't make me regret this," he said, his voice carrying a note of warning. Henry paused for a moment, his back still turned. "I won't, sir." The first few weeks of Henry's employment passed uneventfully. He was efficient, punctual, and seemed to anticipate William's needs before he even voiced them. Still, William found himself unsettled by the man's presence. There was something about him that felt familiar. He dismissed the thought as paranoia. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, William returned to the estate in a foul mood. He tossed his jacket onto a chair and poured himself a glass of whiskey, muttering under his breath about incompetent board members. Henry appeared silently, as he often did, and began tidying the room. "Rough day, sir?" Henry asked, his tone polite but not overly familiar. William shot him a glare. "Don't pretend to care." Henry didn't respond, continuing to straighten the books on a nearby shelf. The silence stretched between them until, finally, William sighed and sank into a chair. "It's the same nonsense every day," he said, more to himself than to Henry. "People think they can undermine me, question my decisions. Do they not realize who I am?" Henry turned slightly, his expression calm. "Perhaps they see you as a man, sir, not as the empire you've built." William frowned, taken aback by the comment. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means, sir," Henry said carefully, "that sometimes people forget what drives a man. They see his actions but not his reasons." William stared at him, unsure whether to feel insulted or intrigued. "And what do you think drives me, Henry?" Henry hesitated, as though weighing his words. "I think, sir, you've spent a long time proving yourself to people who didn't believe in you." William's jaw tightened. He wanted to dismiss the comment, but it hit too close to home. Instead, he took another sip of whiskey and changed the subject. "Do you have family, Henry?" Henry's hand froze briefly as he adjusted a picture frame on the mantel. "I did, sir. A long time ago. William caught the subtle shift in his tone and couldn't help but press further. What happened? Henry straightened and turned to face him. Life has a way of pulling people apart, sir. Sometimes it's circumstances. Sometimes it's choices. There was something in Henry's eyes, an unspoken pain, that made William feel uncomfortable. He looked away, swirling the whiskey in his glass. Well, he said gruffly, I suppose that's life. Yes, sir, Henry said quietly. It is. Late one night, William wandered the halls of the estate, unable to sleep. He found himself in the library, where Henry was methodically dusting the shelves. The room was dimly lit, and the faint scent of leather and old paper filled the air. Don't you ever sleep? William asked, his voice cutting through the silence. Henry glanced at him and gave a faint smile. I find I need less of it these days, sir. William leaned against the doorframe, watching him. Do you ever stop? You're like a machine. Henry paused, his hand resting on the spine of a book. A machine, sir, has no purpose beyond its function. I'd like to think I still have a purpose. William raised an eyebrow. And what purpose is that? Henry turned to him, his expression unreadable. To do what I can while I still can. For a moment, William didn't know how to respond. He felt a strange pang of respect for the man but quickly pushed it aside. Don't wear yourself out, he said, turning to leave. I need you sharp. As you wish, sir, Henry replied, his voice steady. As William walked back to his room, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Henry than met the eye. But for now, he chose to ignore it. Weeks passed, and William found himself reluctantly growing accustomed to Henry's presence. The older man had a way of blending into the background, quietly managing the household without overstepping boundaries. Yet every so often, Henry would say something, an observation, a carefully chosen word, that lingered in William's mind far longer than it should. One rainy evening, William sat in the library, a fire crackling in the hearth as he reviewed reports from his company. His frustrations were mounting. Numbers weren't aligning, and a critical merger was at risk of falling apart. He clenched his jaw, tossing the stack of papers onto the coffee table. Henry appeared silently, as he often did, carrying a tray with a steaming pot of tea. Would you like some tea, sir? He asked, his tone calm and neutral. William gestured dismissively. No, I don't want tea. What I want is a team that doesn't mess up every deal they touch. Henry set the tray down on a nearby table, unperturbed by William's outburst. Sometimes, sir, it's not about the team but the way they're led. William glared at him. Are you trying to say this is my fault? Not at all, sir, Henry replied, his tone measured. I'm merely suggesting that leadership isn't about perfection. It's about adaptation. William snorted, leaning back in his chair. And what would you know about leadership, Henry? You're a butler. Henry paused, his hands stilling briefly before continuing to pour the tea. More than you might think, sir. There it was again, that maddening calm, that quiet confidence. William wanted to push, to demand answers, but something held him back. Instead, he picked up one of the reports and began thumbing through it, pretending to ignore Henry's presence. As Henry moved to leave, William's voice stopped him. You've been here for months now. Why haven't I seen you take a day off? Henry turned, his expression polite but unreadable. I'm here to serve, sir. That requires consistency. William frowned. Everyone needs a break, Henry. You can't just keep going forever. Henry's gaze softened, and for a moment he looked almost wistful. Perhaps not, sir. But some of us have more to atone for than others. Before William could respond, Henry inclined his head slightly and left the room, leaving William to stare after him, a faint sense of unease settling in his chest. The following morning, William was in his office, reviewing the day's schedule when Margaret entered, looking unusually hesitant. Sir, she began, you asked me to handle a background check on Henry when he was hired. William barely glanced up. And? Well, Margaret said, shifting uncomfortably, there were some inconsistencies. I thought they might be worth bringing to your attention. That caught William's attention. He set his pen down and leaned forward. What kind of inconsistencies? Margaret hesitated. His references check out, but there's very little information about his life before he began working in private service. No records of family, no photographs, nothing personal. It's almost as if he just appeared one day. William's brow furrowed. That's odd. Yes, sir, Margaret agreed. And there's one more thing. I came across an old photograph in the estate archives while I was organizing the library. It's from when your family first moved in. I thought you might want to see it. She handed him a faded photograph. William took it, his eyes narrowing as he examined the image. It showed a group of workers standing in front of the estate, smiling for the camera. His parents were there too, younger and happier than he remembered. But what caught his eye was a man standing slightly off to the side, tall, with the same silver hair and composed demeanor as Henry. William stared at the photograph, his mind racing. This can't be right, he murmured. He be what? 20? 30? It's remarkable, isn't it? Margaret said softly. I thought you should know. William waved her away, his thoughts swirling. After she left, he sat in silence, the photograph clutched in his hand. The resemblance was undeniable. But how could Henry have been here all those years ago? It didn't make sense. That evening, William confronted Henry in the study. The butler was polishing a silver tray when William stormed in, holding the photograph. What is this? William demanded, thrusting the picture toward him. Henry looked at it calmly, his expression unreadable. It appears to be an old photograph of the estate, sir. Don't play coy with me, William snapped. That's you, isn't it? Standing right there with my parents? Henry studied the photograph for a moment before setting the tray down and meeting William's gaze. That is, sir. William's breath caught, his anger momentarily replaced by shock. You admit it? You were here? Yes, sir, Henry said simply. Why didn't you say anything? William demanded. Why did you lie? I never lied, sir, Henry replied. You never asked. William's fists clenched. Don't play games with me, Henry. Or you. Why were you here? Henry hesitated, and for the first time, William saw something flicker in his eyes, guilt, perhaps, or regret. I think you already know, sir. The words hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. William's mind raced, piecing together fragments of memory, the familiarity he had felt, the lingering sense of recognition. No, he said, shaking his head. It can't be. I'm sorry, William, Henry said quietly. I'm your father. The room seemed to tilt, the weight of the revelation crashing down on William like a tidal wave. He staggered back, gripping the edge of the desk for support. You're lying, he whispered. I'm not, Henry said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. I was here with your mother when you were a boy. But I left, and I've regretted it every day since. William's anger flared. You left? You abandoned us? And now you just show up, acting like some noble servant? What kind of man does that? A man who made mistakes, Henry said, his voice breaking slightly. A man who thought he was doing what was best, even if it wasn't. William turned away, his hands trembling. He wanted to scream, to throw something, to make sense of the storm of emotions swirling inside him. But all he could do was stand there, staring at the fire as it crackled in the hearth. Get out, he said finally, his voice cold. Leave this house? William, Henry began. I said get out. William shouted, spinning to face him. I don't want to see you again. Ever. Henry bowed his head, a look of profound sadness crossing his face. As you wish, sir. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving William alone with the photograph still clutched in his hand. The house felt eerily silent after Henry's departure. William paced the study, the photograph still clutched in his hand. His thoughts raced, alternating between disbelief, anger, and something he couldn't quite identify. Regret, perhaps, though he would never admit it. The fire in the hearth had burned low, casting long shadows across the room. William stopped pacing and stared into the embers, his mind replaying fragments of his childhood. His father had always been a ghost, a name rarely spoken, a figure shrouded in resentment and pain. And now that ghost had a face. He sank into the armchair, exhausted, and stared at the photograph again. The young man in the picture, the man who had stood beside his mother, looked so much like Henry that there could be no denying it. But why now? Why come back after all these years? William downed the rest of his whiskey, the liquid burning his throat. He needed answers, but the thought of facing Henry again made his stomach churn. The next day, William tried to distract himself with work, burying himself in reports and meetings. But his thoughts kept drifting back to the previous night. His temper flared during a conference call, and by noon, he had dismissed his entire staff for the day, unable to focus. As he wandered the estate, he found himself drawn to the library, where Henry had spent so much of his time. The room still carried the faint scent of polish and old books. William's eyes scanned the shelves until they landed on a small, worn leather notebook tucked between two volumes. Curiosity got the better of him, and he pulled the notebook free. Flipping it open, he found neat, careful handwriting, Henry's. The pages were filled with notes about the estate, maintenance schedules, inventory lists, even small personal observations about the staff. But as William turned the pages, the entries became more personal. He hesitated, then read on. June 3rd. William works late every night. He eats alone. I've tried to offer subtle encouragement, but he brushes it off. I see so much of his mother in him, her determination, her pride. But I also see the pain my absence caused. He doesn't know it, but I've been here, watching, trying to atone in small ways. It will never be enough, but it's all I can offer now. July 15th. The estate feels like a mausoleum. William doesn't let anyone in, not emotionally, not physically. He's built walls so high that even I struggle to find a way through. But I see glimpses of the boy he once was, the boy I left behind. I hope one day he'll understand why I did what I did. William closed the notebook, his hands trembling. The words were raw, filled with regret and an aching love that he hadn't expected. He pressed his fingers to his temples, trying to process the flood of emotions. Why hadn't Henry told him sooner? Why had he chosen to suffer in silence instead of explaining himself? William clenched his jaw and left the library, the notebook still in his hand. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, William found himself driving through the city. He didn't have a destination in mind, but his subconscious seemed to guide him. Before long, he found himself parked outside a modest apartment building, one that he recognized from the file Margaret had given him. This was where Henry had been living before coming to the estate. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the car door handle. Part of him wanted to drive away, to leave the past buried where it belonged. But the notebook's words lingered in his mind, pulling at something deep within him. With a deep breath, he stepped out of the car and approached the building. Henry opened the door, his expression unreadable. He was dressed casually, a stark contrast to the polished butler's uniform William had grown accustomed to. "William," he said softly. "I didn't expect to see you." William's jaw tightened. "We need to talk." Henry stepped aside, gesturing for him to enter. The apartment was small but tidy, filled with simple, functional furniture. A few personal items dotted the shelves, books, framed photographs, but the space felt more like a temporary refuge than a home. William sat on the edge of the couch, the notebook clutched in his hand. "I found this," he said, holding it up. Henry's eyes flicked to the notebook, and a flicker of emotion crossed his face. "I see. You've been keeping tabs on me," William said, his tone accusatory. "Why?" Henry sighed and sat across from him. "Because I needed to see if you were all right." William scoffed. "All right? Do I look like I'm all right, Henry? Do you have any idea what it was like, growing up without you? Watching my mother struggle, wondering why you left." Henry's shoulders sagged, and for the first time, William saw the weight of guilt that the older man carried. "I know," Henry said quietly. "And I've carried that guilt with me every day of my life." "Then why?" William demanded. "Why did you leave? Why didn't you come back?" Henry hesitated, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "It's not a simple answer, William. There were circumstances. Things your mother and I thought were best left buried." "Stop talking in riddles," William snapped. "I deserve the truth." Henry met his gaze, his expression pained. "Your grandfather, your mother's father, made it very clear that I wasn't welcome in the family. He threatened to cut her off completely if she stayed with me. I thought leaving would protect her, give her and you a better life." William's breath caught. He hadn't expected this. So you just walked away? I didn't want to, Henry said, his voice breaking. But I didn't see another choice. I was young and I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought she'd be better off without me. William's anger flared again. Do you know how pathetic that sounds? You abandoned us because of some old man's threats? Henry didn't respond immediately, his gaze fixed on the floor. I came back once, he said finally. Years ago. I wanted to see you, to explain everything. But when I saw how well your mother was doing, how strong she was, I convinced myself that I'd only make things worse. William stared at him, his emotions a tangled mess of anger, confusion, and an ache he couldn't quite name. So you just watched from a distance? Like some ghost? Yes, Henry said simply. Because I didn't know how to be anything else. The two men sat in silence, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. For the first time, William saw his father not as the imposing, mysterious butler, but as a flawed, broken man who had made terrible mistakes. I don't know if I can forgive you, William said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Henry nodded, his expression resigned. I understand. William stood, clutching the notebook to his chest. I need time. Henry rose as well, his movements slow and deliberate. Take all the time you need. I'll be here if you ever want to talk. William hesitated at the door, his hand resting on the handle. Why did you take the job? Why not just tell me who you were? Henry's voice was soft but steady. Because I didn't think I deserved to be your father. I thought I could at least try to make up for what I'd done by serving you. William's throat tightened, and he nodded once before walking out into the night. The days that followed were marked by a strange quiet at the estate. William threw himself into his work, drowning out the emotions that threatened to resurface every time he thought about Henry. Yet, the notebook remained on his desk, a constant reminder of the confrontation and the unanswered questions that still lingered. One evening, as William sat alone in the library, the silence became too much to bear. He stared at the photograph Margaret had given him, his mother's smile frozen in time, and Henry standing in the background, looking younger but unmistakably the same. It stirred something in him, an ache that felt like longing but also anger. He picked up his phone and dialed Margaret. Send someone to bring Henry back to the estate, he said curtly. I'll speak with him tomorrow. Henry arrived the next morning, looking as composed as ever. He stood in the foyer, his hands clasped neatly in front of him, but there was a tension in his posture that William hadn't noticed before. Sir, Henry greeted him, his tone formal. Follow me, William said, leading him to the study. Once inside, he closed the door and gestured for Henry to sit, though he remained standing himself. I've been thinking, William began, pacing slowly. You say you left because of my grandfather. Because you thought it was the right thing to do. That's correct, sir, Henry said quietly. And yet, William continued, turning to face him, you came back. You watched from a distance. You kept notes. But if you thought we were better off without you, why not stay away? Henry took a deep breath, his expression softening. Because I was wrong. The admission caught William off guard. He blinked, his brow furrowing. What do you mean? I thought I was protecting you and your mother, Henry said, his voice heavy with regret. But all I did was abandon the people I cared about most. I convinced myself that I was doing it for you, but the truth is, I was scared. Scared of failing, scared of what your grandfather would do. It was cowardice, William, plain and simple. William stared at him, the words hitting harder than he expected. For so long, he had built up an image of his father as a selfish, heartless man. Hearing Henry admit to his fears and regrets chipped away at that image, leaving him unsure of what to feel. You had a choice, William said after a long silence. You could have stayed and fought for us. Instead, you ran. Henry nodded. You're right. And I'll regret that choice for the rest of my life. The sincerity in his voice was undeniable, and it unsettled William. He turned away, running a hand through his hair. Why did you come back now? Why take the job as my butler? Henry hesitated, his gaze steady. Because I wanted to help you in whatever way I could. I didn't know how to approach you as your father, but as your butler, I thought I could at least make your life easier. It was selfish, I know, but it was all I could think to do. William's jaw tightened, and he leaned against the desk, his arms crossed. And what do you expect me to do now? Forgive you? Pretend like none of this happened? No, Henry said softly. I don't expect anything, William. I just wanted you to know the truth. What you do with it is up to you. For the next few weeks, Henry resumed his duties at the estate, though the dynamic between him and William was noticeably different. William no longer barked orders at him or dismissed him with sharp words. Instead, their interactions were filled with an unspoken tension, as though both men were waiting for the other to make the next move. Late one night, William found himself wandering the halls again. He stopped outside Henry's quarters, the door slightly ajar. Inside, he saw Henry sitting at a small desk, his head bowed as he wrote in a notebook. The scene reminded William of his own late nights in the study, consumed by work and solitude. He knocked lightly on the doorframe, and Henry looked up, startled. "Sir," he said, standing immediately. "Is something wrong?" "No," William said, stepping inside. "I just wanted to talk." Henry nodded and gestured for him to sit, but William remained standing, his hands in his pockets. He glanced around the modest room, taking in the sparse furnishings and the stack of books on the bedside table. "Do you ever stop working?" William asked, his tone lighter than usual. Henry smiled faintly. "Old habits, sir." William hesitated, then pulled the chair from the desk and sat down. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "What was she like?" "My mother. Before everything." Henry's expression softened, and he sat back down, his hands clasped in his lap. "She was extraordinary. Strong, kind, fiercely intelligent. She had this way of making everyone around her feel seen, valued. And she loved you more than anything in the world." William's throat tightened. He hadn't heard anyone speak about his mother that way in years. "And you? Did you love her?" "With all my heart," Henry said without hesitation. "Leaving her was the hardest thing I've ever done. But she was the one who convinced me it was necessary. She thought it was the only way to protect you." William looked away, his hands gripping the edge of the chair. "She never talked about you. Not once. It was like you didn't exist." Henry's gaze dropped, his shoulders sagging. "I don't blame her. I gave her every reason to hate me." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the past hanging heavy between them. Finally, William spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think she would forgive you? If she were here?" Henry looked up, his eyes glistening. "I don't know. But I'd like to think she would." William nodded slowly, his emotions a tangled mess. He stood, his movements stiff. "Good night, Henry." "Good night, sir," Henry said, his voice steady despite the tears threatening to spill. As the days turned into weeks, William found himself opening up to Henry in small but significant ways. They shared quiet conversations over tea, moments of reflection in the library. Henry never pushed, never demanded more than William was willing to give. And slowly, William began to see him not just as the man who had abandoned him, but as the man who was trying, in his own flawed way, to make amends. The final breakthrough came one evening, when a major crisis at the company threatened to unravel everything William had built. A key investor was pulling out, and the board was in chaos. William returned to the estate late that night, his face pale and drawn. Henry was waiting for him in the study, a tray of tea and sandwiches on the desk. "You look like you haven't eaten all day," he said gently. "I haven't," William admitted, sinking into the armchair. Henry poured a cup of tea and handed it to him. "Tell me what's wrong." William hesitated, then began to explain the situation. As he spoke, Henry listened intently, occasionally offering a word of advice or encouragement. By the time William finished, he felt a strange sense of relief, as though a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "You'll get through this," Henry said with quiet confidence. "You always do." William looked at him, the walls he had built around himself finally beginning to crumble. "I don't know how you do it," he said. "After everything, after all the mistakes, you're still here." Henry smiled faintly. "Because I believe in you, William. I always have." For the first time, William felt the truth of those words. And for the first time, he allowed himself to believe them. The following morning, William woke with a clarity he hadn't felt in years. The conversation with Henry the previous night lingered in his mind, its weight undeniable. For so long, he had held onto the pain of abandonment, wearing it like armor. But now, for the first time, that armor felt like a burden he no longer wanted to carry. He spent the day pacing his office, drafting and redrafting emails to the board as he worked to salvage the crisis at his company. Henry's calm assurance from the night before replayed in his mind, bolstering his confidence. By mid-afternoon, William had brokered a meeting with the wavering investor, laying the groundwork for a potential resolution. As the sun set, painting the estate in golden hues, William found himself walking toward the garden, a place he rarely visited. He found Henry there, kneeling among the flower beds, his sleeves rolled up as he carefully pruned a rose bush. The sight stopped William in his tracks. There was something almost peaceful about the older man's presence, as though the chaos of the world couldn't touch him here. "You're full of surprises," William said, breaking the quiet. Henry looked up, brushing dirt from his hands. "Gardening has always been a comfort to me. It reminds me that growth takes time and care." William smirked faintly, leaning against a nearby tree. "Is that another one of your metaphors?" Henry chuckled softly. "Perhaps." They stood in silence for a moment, the air filled with the soft rustle of leaves and the distant chirping of birds. Finally, William spoke, his tone quieter than usual. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began. "About why you left. About why you came back." Henry stood, brushing off his trousers. And, William said, hesitating, "I still don't know if I can forgive you. But I think I want to try." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, Henry said nothing. Then he nodded, his expression softening. "That's all I could ask for." William exhaled, feeling a weight lift from his chest. "Good. Because I think we have a lot to talk about." Over the next several weeks, William and Henry began to rebuild their relationship piece by piece. It wasn't easy, years of resentment didn't disappear overnight, but both men were committed to the process. They spent more time together, sharing stories and memories, filling in the gaps that had grown between them. One evening, as they sat in the library, William asked a question that had been on his mind for weeks. "Why didn't you ever try to tell me the truth?" "Not as a child, but later, when I was old enough to understand." Henry set his teacup down, his expression thoughtful. "Because I was afraid, William. Afraid you'd hate me. Afraid that hearing the truth would reopen old wounds." William leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "And you think it didn't hurt, not knowing? Wondering why my father didn't care enough to be there?" Henry flinched at the words, but he didn't look away. "I made mistakes, William. More than I can count. And I'll carry the weight of those mistakes for the rest of my life. But I never stopped caring about you. Not for a single day." The sincerity in Henry's voice was undeniable, and it chipped away at the anger William still clung to. He nodded slowly, accepting the words even if he wasn't ready to fully let go of the pain. As the weeks turned into months, William began to notice changes in himself. He was still driven, still demanding, but the sharp edges of his personality began to soften. His employees noticed the difference. His meetings were less tense, his temper less volatile. Even Margaret commented on the change one day as she handed him a stack of reports. "You seem lighter, sir," she said cautiously. William raised an eyebrow. "Lighter?" "Yes," she said with a small smile. "Less burdened?" He didn't respond, but later, as he sat in his office, her words echoed in his mind. For so long, he had carried the weight of his father's absence, allowing it to shape every aspect of his life. Now, with Henry back, that weight was beginning to lift. One evening, Henry approached William in the study, a large envelope in his hand. "I thought you might want to see this," he said, setting it on the desk. William frowned, opening the envelope. Inside were old photographs, some he recognized from his childhood, others he had never seen before. One in particular caught his eye, a black and white image of his parents, young and smiling, holding a newborn baby. "Where did you get these?" William asked, his voice hushed. "I kept them," Henry said simply. "They were all I had left of you and your mother." William stared at the photograph, his throat tightening. For so long, he had believed his father had forgotten about him, moved on without a second thought. But here was proof that Henry had carried pieces of their family with him, even in his absence. "I don't know what to say," William admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "You don't have to say anything," Henry said gently. "I just thought you should have them." William nodded, carefully placing the photographs back in the envelope. "Thank you." The turning point came on a crisp autumn morning, when William received a call from the investor he had been negotiating with for weeks. The deal was finalized, the crisis averted. As he hung up the phone, a rare smile spread across his face. He found Henry in the kitchen, polishing silverware. "The deal went through," William announced. Henry looked up, his expression brightening. "Congratulations, sir." "I couldn't have done it without you," William admitted. "You were right about everything, about leadership, about adaptation. You helped me see things differently." Henry smiled faintly, setting the silverware aside. "I didn't do anything you weren't already capable of, William. You just needed to trust yourself." William nodded, his respect for Henry growing deeper. I think I'd like you to stay. Not as my butler, but as my father." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, Henry looked as though he might cry. He nodded, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "I'd like that very much." That evening, as the sun set over the estate, William and Henry stood side by side in the garden, watching the sky turn shades of orange and pink. For the first time in years, William felt a sense of peace. "I think she'd be proud of us," William said quietly, breaking the silence. Henry glanced at him, his expression soft. "I think so too." They stood in silence, the weight of the past finally giving way to the promise of the future. And for the first time, William allowed himself to believe that he wasn't alone. The days following William's decision to accept Henry as his father were unlike any he had experienced before. The house felt different, warmer somehow, as though the ghosts that had haunted its grand halls were finally at peace. William began to see his estate not as a fortress to shield himself from the world, but as a home, a place where he could begin to heal. Henry continued to work at the estate, though his role had shifted. He no longer saw himself as simply a butler. William had made it clear that his place was as a part of the family, not just as an employee. Yet, Henry insisted on keeping busy, saying it helped him feel useful. William didn't argue. He knew better than to try and stop the man from working. One afternoon, as William was preparing for another round of negotiations with the board, he found Henry in the library. The older man was sorting through old books, his hands careful as he placed them on the shelves. "Henry," William said, leaning against the doorway. "Do you have a moment?" Henry turned, smiling faintly. "Of course." William stepped into the room, his hands in his pockets. "I've been thinking about what you said. About my mother. About everything." Henry set the book he was holding onto the table, giving William his full attention. And, William began, hesitating, "I think it's time we do something to honor her. Something to make sure she's remembered." Henry's expression softened. "What do you have in mind?" William gestured toward the family portrait that hung above the fireplace. "This house has always been a monument to our family's legacy. But it's missing something. I want to commission a new portrait, one that includes her and you." Henry blinked, clearly surprised. "William, that's incredibly generous." "It's not generosity," William said firmly. "It's what she deserves. And what we deserve." Henry's throat tightened, but he nodded. "I'd be honored." The weeks that followed were filled with preparations for the portrait. William hired one of the finest artists in the country, a woman renowned for her ability to capture not just the likeness of her subjects, but the essence of who they were. She spent hours with William and Henry, asking questions about their lives, their relationship, their journey toward reconciliation. The process was cathartic for both men. As they shared their stories with the artist, they found themselves opening up to each other in ways they hadn't before. Henry spoke of his years away, the regrets that haunted him, and the quiet moments of joy he found in seeing William's successes from afar. William, in turn, shared his struggles with loneliness, his doubts about his own worth, and the pain of feeling abandoned. By the time the portrait was completed, both men felt as though a weight had been lifted. The painting was unveiled in a small ceremony attended by close friends and associates of the Armitage family. It depicted William, Henry, and William's mother in a scene that radiated warmth and unity. For the first time, William saw his family not as a fractured past, but as a foundation for the future. Months later, as the estate settled into its new rhythm, William found himself reflecting on how much his life had changed. The business was thriving, his relationships with his employees had improved, and most importantly, he had found a sense of peace he hadn't known was possible. One evening, as he and Henry sat by the fire, William turned to his father. "Do you ever think about what things would have been like if you'd stayed?" Henry considered the question carefully. "All the time," he admitted, "but I try not to dwell on it. Regret is a heavy burden to carry, and I've learned that the only way to lighten it is to focus on what I can do now." William nodded, understanding the sentiment. "Do you think we'll ever truly move past it? The mistakes, the pain?" "I don't think it's about moving past it," Henry said thoughtfully. "I think it's about learning to carry it differently. Turning it into something that strengthens us instead of weighing us down." William looked into the fire, the flickering flames reflecting in his eyes. "You've changed me, you know. In ways I didn't think were possible." Henry smiled, his expression filled with quiet pride. "And you've changed me, William. More than you'll ever know." The story of William and Henry became one that people in the community spoke of for years. The cold, distant millionaire who had once been known for his sharp tongue and ruthless demeanor was now seen as a man of integrity and compassion. And at his side, always, was the father who had once been a stranger but was now an inseparable part of his life. As time went on, William continued to build on the legacy his mother and father had left him. The estate became a place not just of wealth, but of generosity, a space where others could come to find solace, guidance, and the sense of belonging that William himself had fought so hard to reclaim. In the end, the bond between William and Henry proved stronger than the years of pain and separation that had once defined their relationship. It wasn't perfect, it was never going to be, but it was real. And that, William realized, was enough. One evening, as they walked through the garden together, Henry paused, looking up at the sky. "Do you ever wonder what she'd say? Your mother?" William followed his gaze, a soft smile playing on his lips. "I think she'd be proud. Of both of us." Henry nodded, his expression peaceful. "I think so too." They stood there for a long time, the silence between them filled with unspoken understanding. And for the first time in years, William felt truly at home, not just in the estate, but in his own heart. As winter descended on the estate, the once vast gardens were now blanketed in snow, their pristine white expanses broken only by the occasional footprints of the staff. William stood by the window of the library, watching the snow fall in steady flurries. His tea sat untouched on the table behind him, the steam curling in delicate spirals. Henry entered quietly, carrying a bundle of letters. "The morning correspondence, sir," he said, placing the letters on the desk. William turned, his gaze softening as he looked at his father. "You don't have to call me sir anymore, you know." Henry smiled faintly. "Old habits die hard, William. Then break them," William replied with a small chuckle. "You're not my butler anymore." Henry inclined his head slightly. "Force of habit, I suppose. But I'll try." William gestured toward the chair opposite him. "Sit. We need to talk." Henry hesitated for a moment before obliging, lowering himself into the chair. He studied his son's expression, sensing a weight behind his words. "What's on your mind?" William took a deep breath, his fingers tracing the edge of his teacup. "I've been thinking about legacy. About what this estate, this family, really stands for." "And?" Henry prompted gently. "And I don't want it to be what it was before," William said firmly. "For years, this place was a symbol of wealth, power, and exclusivity. But I want it to mean more than that. I want it to stand for something better." Henry's brow furrowed slightly, curiosity flickering in his eyes. "What do you have in mind?" William leaned forward, his hands clasped. "I want to open the estate to the public. Create a foundation in my mother's name, something that supports education, art, and community. I want this place to inspire people, not intimidate them." Henry smiled, pride evident in his expression. "That's a wonderful idea, William. She would have loved that." William nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I thought so too. But it's not just about honoring her, it's about making this place feel alive again. For both of us." Henry's gaze softened, and he reached across the table, resting a hand on William's. "You've grown into a remarkable man. Your mother would be so proud. And so am I." Over the next few weeks, William and Henry worked tirelessly to bring the foundation to life. They transformed one of the estate's grand ballrooms into an art gallery, filling it with pieces that celebrated creativity and resilience. Another wing was converted into a library and study space, complete with workshops and mentorship programs for underprivileged youth. Word of the project spread quickly, and soon the estate was buzzing with activity. Artists, educators, and community leaders came together to support the foundation, their energy breathing new life into the once quiet halls. William found himself invigorated by the work, his vision finally coming to fruition. But as the opening day approached, a letter arrived that threatened to unravel everything. The letter was addressed to Henry, written in a shaky, almost illegible script. As he read it, his face grew pale, the usual calm in his expression replaced by unease. William noticed immediately. "What is it?" he asked, setting down the plans he'd been reviewing. Henry hesitated, the letter trembling slightly in his hand. "It's from your grandfather's estate?" William's jaw tightened at the mention of the man who had driven his father away. What could they possibly want after all this time? "They've requested a meeting," Henry said, his voice strained. "Apparently, there are unresolved matters regarding the Armitage family trust." William frowned, his mind racing. "That doesn't make sense. We've had control of the trust for years. Why now?" Henry shook his head, his expression troubled. "I don't know. But something about this doesn't feel right." Despite his reservations, William agreed to the meeting. They traveled to a small law office on the outskirts of the city, where they were greeted by an elderly attorney who introduced himself as Mr. Langston. "Thank you for coming," Langston said, gesturing for them to sit. "I'll get straight to the point. Your grandfather left certain provisions in the trust that were contingent on specific, familial conditions." William raised an eyebrow. "What conditions?" Langston adjusted his glasses, glancing at Henry. "The trust stipulates that all direct descendants of the Armitage line must be accounted for. If not, the trust reverts to a third-party entity." William's eyes narrowed. "What are you implying?" Langston hesitated before continuing. "There's a clause in the trust that requires the recognition of Mr. Henry Armitage as a legitimate heir. Without that recognition, the trust becomes null and void." The room fell silent, the weight of Langston's words settling over them. William looked at Henry, whose expression was a mixture of guilt and unease. "So this is what it's about," William said bitterly. "This isn't about family. It's about money." "No," Henry said firmly, his voice steady. "That's not why I came back, William. You have to believe me." William stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "How can I? You've been hiding this from me the whole time." Henry rose as well, his eyes filled with urgency. "Because I didn't want this to define us. I came back for you, not for the trust." Langston cleared his throat awkwardly. "If I may, gentlemen, this situation can be resolved quickly. A simple declaration from Mr. William Armitage acknowledging Mr. Henry Armitage's status as a legitimate heir will suffice." William turned to the attorney, his expression hard. "And if I refuse?" "The trust will revert to the designated third party," Langston said plainly. "The Armitage family legacy, as you know it, will be lost." The drive back to the estate was tense, neither man speaking a word. Once they arrived, William stormed into the study, slamming the door behind him. Henry followed, his demeanor calm but determined. "You have every right to be angry," Henry said, standing near the door. "But please hear me out." William turned, his eyes blazing. "You lied to me, Henry. After everything, I trusted you, and now this?" Henry stepped closer, his voice filled with emotion. "I didn't lie. I just didn't know how to tell you. I didn't want this to overshadow what we've been building." "Well, it has," William snapped. Do you have any idea how this makes me feel? Like a pawn in some game I didn't even know I was playing? Henry's shoulders sagged, and he looked down at the floor. I never wanted this for you. I just wanted to make things right. William stared at him, his anger beginning to waver. He saw the pain in Henry's eyes, the weight of his guilt. Slowly, he sank into the armchair, burying his face in his hands. After a long silence, he spoke, his voice muffled. I don't know what to do. Henry approached cautiously, sitting in the chair across from him. Whatever you decide, I'll accept it. But know this, I'm here for you, not the trust. Not the money. Just you. William looked up, his eyes searching Henry's face for any trace of deceit. He found none. The following day, William made his decision. He met with Langston, signing the necessary documents to acknowledge Henry as a legitimate heir. But he made one thing clear. This was about honoring the truth, not preserving the trust. When he returned to the estate, Henry was waiting for him in the foyer. William handed him a copy of the signed papers, his expression unreadable. It's done, he said simply. Henry took the papers, his hands trembling. Thank you. William nodded, his voice softer now. Don't thank me. Just don't give me a reason to regret it. You won't, Henry promised. In the months that followed, the foundation flourished. The estate became a beacon of hope and inspiration, its halls filled with laughter and creativity. And while the challenges of the past still lingered, William and Henry faced them together, their bonds stronger than ever. As spring arrived, bringing new life to the gardens, William found himself standing by the portrait in the gallery. Henry joined him, and together they admired the painting, a symbol of the family they had fought so hard to rebuild. Do you think we'll ever get it all right? William asked quietly. Henry smiled, his hand resting on his son's shoulder. I think we'll get close. And that's enough. For William, it was more than enough.